In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a bookshelf that's affordable and beginner friendly, and this is going to be a step-by-step guide. And if you're new to this channel, my name's Josh. This channel is all about DIY to save a ton of money, so be sure to subscribe, ring that bell so you get a notification every time I release a new video, and hammer that like button for me. That's all I ask in return for making this video. So we got a lot to go over today, so let's get started. The first step to building a bookshelf that's affordable and beginner friendly is your material selection. Using dimensional lumber that is typically used for framing is going to be accessible, and it's also easy to work with, and it's something that most people are familiar with. But whenever you're selecting your material, make sure that you eyeball down it and across it to make sure it isn't really warped or really crowned. So all we have to do to inspect it is flip it up on side, look down the board this way to see if it's crowned or bowed, and then look down the board this way to see if it's cupped really bad. Again, because material is never perfect, select lumber that's acceptable and move on. So I'm going to be building this bookshelf out of 2x12s. I got 8-footers and 10-footers. Most people could use all 8-footers because by the time you cut down for your shelving and also the height, 8-footers are going to be plenty. But because I'm making this customized for my mudroom, it's going to be a little taller than normal, so I had to get 10-foot 2x12s for this. I'm going to use these as the side panels and cut them to length. Because this framing dimensional lumber is typically made out of pine, it can be stained or it could also be painted. So either way, it's going to be acceptable if you need to add some color or if you're trying to give everything a wood grain appearance. This is going to be a great choice. If you're interested in building this exact bookshelf, I'll put the material list and links to each product in the description below. Here is a 2x12 that I'm going to use as a side panel for the bookshelf. I'm going to cut it down to 98.5 inch. So that way, whenever I put my top on, it's going to give me an equal 100 inch altogether bookshelf. And that is going to be important because I want it to match my mudroom's top shelf. The first step in making the side panels in order to hold the shelving boards is to address the routing it's going to take in order to do the backing and also to hold the shelves. This is the backing I'm going to be using. This is the shiplap from my last video where I put this on my mudroom, so I want the back to match the back of the mudroom. And because of that, this is 3/4 inch thick. And I'm going to have to route the back in order to secure the 3/4 inch thick shiplap to, and I want it countersunk from the back so that way it ain't sticking out, and so that way you won't see it from the side, so it'll conceal it and it's going to look really good that way. You could also use Lowe on here or 1/4 inch sanded plywood or even 1/2 inch plywood or 3/4 inch, whatever you want to use, but this is something I'm going to use to match what I got. The cheapest option would be to use Lowe on. It's going to be cheaper than a 1/4 inch sanded plywood, and it's going to be cheaper than the 3/4 inch, obviously. So that's just a little tip. I've made a bookshelf before using that, and it turned out really good. So I'm going to route out a strip here off the edge that's going to be in the back. And another tip, make sure you select the side that you want to be facing inside of the bookshelf. This side is what I want to be the inside of the bookshelf. So wherever side you're routing is going to be the side that's going to be the inside. So if the bookshelf is going to be sitting somewhere where you're going to see the one side better than the other, so you might want to switch the bad side of the board to the good side of the board, because every board is going to have a good or bad side. So this side I want on the inside. This is the router setup I'm going to be using to route out the back for the shiplap. And this is a 3/4 inch router bit that's straight. And the great thing about this is it's already thickness of the shiplap, so I don't have to make multiple cuts to get the right depth. And I need to get the measurement from the edge of this rounded plate in order to know how far to put my straight edge to make the cut. If I take the measurement, it looks like we got 3 3/8. So that's going to be an important measurement to clamp our straight edge to the board in order to make a straight cut. Let's say I didn't have a 3/4 inch router bit and I need to make a 3/4 inch groove for a 3/4 inch board. Let's say I only had a 1/2 inch. I can make 2 cuts in order to route it out correctly, just so you know. So you don't have to specifically buy a bit for this. You can make do by making multiple cuts. In order to make a straight cut with the router, I'm going to use the other board that we're going to use as a side panel as a straight edge and measure over 3 3/8 from this end and then 3 3/8 from this end and make a mark, and then clamp this board using these clamps to this board so I have a straight edge to work as a guide. In order to use the router, we first unlock this area here, and then we need to make sure that we get the depth to where we're only taking off about 1/8, maybe a little more at most. So we're going to lock it in about right there. And then after it's locked in, we'll be able to run our first pass. And then after we run our first pass, we're going to unlock it. Then we're going to drop it down again another 1/8, maybe a little more, maybe 3/16, something like that. Lock it, run it, and then we're going to, after we run it that second time, go down a little further and a little further each time till we get about 3/4 inch taken off the edge of the board. So that's just a little rundown how to use the router. And the reason why you got to do that in increments is because this will not take off 3/4 inch at once. You got to slowly take it off one pass at a time. I'm going to get on my respirator, eye protection, ear protection, and run it right down the side. We now have a 3/4 inch groove on both of our boards for our side panels, and that's going to work out great to conceal the back. It's now time to begin laying out for our shelving boards. I'm going to be using 2x12s ripped down to fit for our shelving boards. So because of that, we have an 1.5 inch thickness that we need to consider. And it depends on the height of your bookshelf is how much space and what kind of spacing you want in general because of what kind of items you're going to be putting on your bookshelf. So if you're using this for something other than books, let's say like a pantry, you might want to leave some taller sections for cereal boxes, etc. Or if you have some really oddly tall books, you want to leave a shelf space for that. I'm going to evenly space mine down from the top 12 1/4. And because there's an 1.5 inch space with that, it's going to give me a slightly higher bottom shelf compared to the rest of them, which is totally fine, but they're going to be about the same. So I'm going to start here, have these boards lined up perfectly, and place my layout down each board before we route them out. Here is the bottom shelf. All I have to do is take my framing square, line it up right off the edge here. We're going to slide it over and then mark 10 inches. And that is where we're going to stop the shelf. And that's going to give us a nice reveal here. So that gives us that much that we're going to leave on because we want to make sure that we countersink this back because that's going to give us our best look. So this is going to get routed out. I'm now going to mark the layout for each shelf going down each side panel. All right, we got our side panels laid out. Here is a sample of a shelf that I'm going to be using. Not this exact piece, but it's a scrap I had for this example. I have a router bit that's a 1/2 inch, and the reason why I'm going to switch over to that, if you look at the rounded over edge that's already from the factory on these boards, it's going to match that really well. So whenever we route out our layout, this rounded over edge template's going to be right, and it's going to give us our best fit. And whenever we route these out, we need to allow just a little bit on each side, about 1/8 inch or so, just allow for any little bit of cupping we have on each board. So we need to make a template for our router. I'm going to cut this out and use it as a jig in order to clamp it down on each layout. So I'm first going to switch over to this router bit, get some measurements, and then cut this out for our jig. This is a 1/2 inch straight router bit. So we know from the center it's going to take 1/4 from each side, and our total width is 6 inches of this base. So we know if we were to place this in a 6-inch slot or sled, that we would have a 1/2-inch circle in the middle. If I want to cut out a slot that's 1 5/8 enough to allow the 2x12 to slide in fairly easy, we need to make sure that we take the 1 5/8 divided by 2, and that's going to give us how much we need from the center of the router bit, and we got to use the base as our measurement. So with that being said, 1 5/8 would be 3/4 heavy off each side. When I say heavy, I mean add a 1/16 to 3/4. So if this is a 1/2 inch, subtract that by 1 5/8, that gives me 1 1/8 that I need to add to this base measurement. So if we have the 6 inches, we need to make sure that we make it a 7 1/8 inch wide slot to give us the proper width that we need to take out. I'm going to make this jig by cutting a U shape out of this to represent the edge of the board. I now need to cut that out to give me a sled or jig to place the router in. Before using the jig on our good side panels, I'm going to use a scrap piece of 2x12, clamp it on here lining up on this edge, and make a test cut just to make sure it works before using it on the good side panel. Using a scrap piece of 2x12, I'm going to set it right into that slot, and that looks like it lines up really good. So that looks like it's going to work just fine. And just take note that this is going to be ripped down yet for our shelving boards. And so if we take a measurement, that gives us 10 inches. That's actually going to route out if we line it up off the edge of the board. In order to route out the area for the shelving board, I need to come up 2 3/4 inch to represent the inside of the jig. And I'm going to burn 1 inch, so in other words, allow 1 inch to mark the inch mark for our measurement. And that's going to be the front of our jig. And then back here on this side, same thing. We're coming right off that straight line we made earlier. I'm now going to take my jig, line it up with those marks on the inside. And again, it's going to be different for every router, but for this one, that's what we got. Then I'm going to line the edges up where we routed off before, because we know we want the 10-inch shelving boards to come out this way. We're just going to clamp that into place. And it's now ready for me to route out. The depth I want is to take it down 1/8, then another 1/8 for a total of 1/4 inch countersunk into this board. And then rinse and repeat that for the whole board. If you take a look, all the slots line up with each other, and with the backs together and we flip it up, you can see that once the back's on and we have our shelving boards in place, it's all going to line up really nice. So that was the most time consuming part, and the rest is going to be much quicker now that we got these done. So next we got to cut the shelving boards and then the top. Next I'm going to cut the shelving boards, and depends on the exact width you want your bookshelf is what determines the width or the length of the shelf itself. Me, I don't have to have an exact width. I'm just shooting for around 48 inches, which is 4 foot. If I measured down to how much we took out of this, we actually took out about 1/4 inch. I'm just going to cut my shelving boards exactly in half from the 8-footer, so I'm going to have 48 inch wide shelving boards, so I'm actually going to have an ultimate width of about 50.5 inches, and that's going to be totally fine for what I'm doing with this bookshelf. So it all depends on your space and how wide you need your bookshelf to how long you need to cut your shelving boards. So I'm going to cut down my 2x12s to 48 inches first, and then we're going to rip them down. I I have 7 shelving boards for this bookshelf, and I need to rip these down to exactly 10 inches. If you remember from when we routed out for our shelving boards on the side panels, we're going to accept a 10-inch shelf easily. Something important here, if you have an edge that's not that desirable, that's the edge you want to make sure that gets ripped off. You want the nice exposed edge to the outside where you're going to see it all the time. So for instance, if we look at this side, we have a knot here, which isn't as desirable as this side that does not have any knots or imperfections. So I'm going to run this down through the table saw. And something else as well, we want to make sure we put 10 inches on this side instead of trying to rip off 1.25 inches, because the width of the actual board can vary. So if you rip them all down 10 inches, they're all going to be 10 inches compared to if there's any variation in the width of the board itself. So I'm going to rip down all 7 of the shelving boards before we continue. Now that the shelving boards are cut, I got to cut a top for the very top of the bookshelf, and this is going to be 50.5 inches by the time the frame is put together with the shelving boards. So I want to cut it just about 1/2 inch longer to give me a 1/4 inch overhang on each side, and I could also cut that down later if I thought it was too much. I'm going to cut the board down to 51 inches for the top of the bookshelf. Now that I have all the framing boards pre-cut, I'm going to sand them down with a palm sander that's using 80 grit sandpaper. And if I run into any rough areas, I got a belt sander here and it also has 80 grit sandpaper. And this is going to help smooth out the top, and it's also going to get off any lettering or imperfections that we can get while we have a bare piece of wood. Before we put stain on it, we're going to hit it first. And after we get everything sanded down, we're going to stain it. So this is a very straightforward process. If you haven't used a palm sander before, you just run it over the board lightly. And then if you see any rough areas, switch over to your belt sander, hit it with that, and then palm sand it again to smooth it out even more. Pretty straightforward. Now that all the boards are sanded, I'm going to use my air hose and just blow all the dust off the boards and bench top before I start staining, because you don't want that dust in the atmosphere or in this area while you're staining. The best you can, try to remove it. And I have the windows cracked, so that way while we're blowing the dust into the atmosphere, it'll go out the windows. And I could also just take a shop vac and shop vac everything off, but that takes a lot more work, so the air hose works just fine. Just make sure you wear a respirator. It's now time to begin the staining process. I put down construction paper on top of my workbench so that way I don't get stain on top of that. I also have the windows cracked like I mentioned before, because this is oil-based and there's some vapors that come off this that you don't want to breathe in. So always wear a respirator while you're doing staining indoors. And it's much better to use water-based while you're indoors if you can. But I had this left over from another job, so I figured I'd use it up. And I have a stir stick, so all we have to do is stir this up really well. I have the old rag that I used before in my previous video, and all I have to do is dip it in the stain and wipe it off. And if it goes on too heavy in some areas, I got another cloth here, and these are just terry towels to wipe off the excess, so that way we don't have too dark of spots compared to the others, because the longer it sets in a spot, the darker it's going to get. So I'm just going to rub a quick layer of this Min Wax, and this is going to be golden oak stain. So it's just going to give it a nice brown tint, and you can see it from the stir stick from before. It just darkens it up and gives it a nice tint. So that way everything blends in really well. So I'm going to begin this process. So I got to put my mask on, so I'm just going to time lapse this. It's a pretty straightforward process. I'm back the following day. The stain has totally dried. We can now assemble the bookshelf, and I'm going to begin by stacking all the boards up out of the way, and I can access the side panels and assemble the shelving boards to the side panels. Here's the left and right side panel. As you know, our slots line up with each other, but we want to pre-drill for our 3.5 inch screws, and we got a countersink with an 1/8 inch bit, and this is going to help hide the screw, and we're going to cover it up here after we get all assembled, and I'll show you that technique here in a bit. But a little trick here, if we flip this board over, we know it's going to line up with this slot, and it's going to be easier to mark our screws that way and pre-drill for them before placing the shelving boards together. To pre-drill for each end of the board, here's the center of the layout that's going to be transcribed here. We're just going to eyeball about the center. We're going to come over 3 inches and make a mark here. Then I'm going to take my speed square this way and do the same thing. We're going to come over 3 inches and make a mark. And that's where we need to pre-drill for our boards. Using the drill with the countersink, we're just going to drill right through the side panel. And if we flip this over, you can see we have holes pre-drilled and it's lined up right where the board's going to be. So we got to do this to the whole side panel. Now time to install the shelving boards. This is pretty straightforward. All we have to do here is set our shelving board onto the workbench, line it up with the slot here. Then we're just going to flip the side panel up in order to line it up correctly, like so. And we're just going to hold the shelving board into the groove and then place the screw in through the side panel, then into the shelf. Just make sure that we're tight towards the front of the panel. We don't want it to sag down and leave a gap like that. We want to make sure we're nice and tight, and that looks good. So we're going to place our screws in from the side to hold it into place. We want to drive it down until it's countersunk and tight to the shelving board. After starting the first panel, I'm going to start the second panel, line it up with the corresponding groove that we routed out. So we're going to do that at the top and bottom. Then we're going to flip it up so we can slide our shelving boards down to the face of the bookshelf. I can now flip the bookshelf over so that way we can slide our shelving boards right down into place. I now can literally slide them right down into the grooves and then place our screws to hold it together. Very simple concept. So we're going to slide them in, then place our screws on each end before continuing to the next step. As for the top, we're going to flush it up with each edge here. And then, if you remember from when I cut this board, I made it a little bit longer so we have the same reveal as an overhang here on each end. So we're going to hold it flush like so, and then we're going to secure it to the side panels from the top using 2 screws, 1 on each end, about 3 inches from the back as well. Now that the bookshelf framing is together, I need to install the backing, but before doing that, I want to patch all these screw holes that I mentioned earlier that I'm going to cover up. And in order to do that, I got wood glue, sawdust from the sawdust that we've created cutting all these boards, a stir stick or some scrap piece of wood that we can use almost as a putty knife. I got a little bit of stain I'm going to add with this so it helps blend in. Even though we're going to stain it again after it sets up, adding stain in it now will help blend it in better later. So we're going to mix all this up to create a wood filler to fill in over these screw holes. To make the wood filler, I'm going to use wood glue and keep stirring it into this sawdust until it creates a paste. Very straightforward here. Now that I created a paste of sawdust and wood glue, I'm going to add a little bit of stain and blend it together until it gets close to the color of the wood. And this is the same stain we used earlier. All right, we now created a wood filler that we're going to patch the screw holes with. To patch the screw holes, we just take a little bit of that paste or putty and just go right over those holes. Then we'll just have to sand that later after it dries to blend it all in really well. Do that at each screw hole. Now that the screw holes are patched, we need to let that dry, so we're going to let that dry while we install the back. And after it dries, we're going to sand it down and stain it. But what we need to do here is make sure we're setting square, because whenever you put this together, it may not be square until it needs racked into position. If you're using a backer that's plywood or Lowe, the ones I mentioned earlier, you can square up the bookshelf using that. You would just nail or secure one side down, rack it in position till it's square with the panel, then secure it. But since I'm using shiplap here, I can't do that. So I'm going to get a diagonal measurement here from corner to corner, and we need to make sure they are the same. So that means we are square or not. This diagonal measurement is 112. Now we need to check the diagonal from this corner to this corner. And this diagonal measurement is 112 also, so that means we are square. If it wasn't square, let's say this side was longer, I would just have to hook a ratchet strap or put together pipe clamps in order to pull this corner towards that corner until we're setting square. But we're setting good here, so now we're going to install the shiplap. In order to install the backing or the shiplap in this case, I need to get a measurement in between the grooves that we routed for the backing. We got 4 foot 1/2 inch. I need to cut all my boards 4 foot 1/2 inch in order to put together the shiplap to make the backing. I now have all the boards cut to length. I actually cut them exactly 48 inches because I just cut the 8-footers right in half. And there's going to be a 1/4 inch catching on each side, so that's going to be totally fine. Something to take note, we got our finished side and then our unfinished side. We're going to place the finished side down because that's going to be exposed, and we want to make sure that we put the edge that does not have the tongue sticking down. Even though this is shiplap, I'm calling this the tongue, but we're going to lay it right into place like so, and we're going to butt it up tight to this top board. And now this first board, we're actually going to put 2 screws on each side because we're going to secure the shelf to the wall from this top board, so we want to make sure it's screwed together. But the remaining ones, I'll show you what to do with those here in just a moment. I'm just going to pre-drill just like I usually would here. And place 2 inch and 5/8 screws on each end. For the next boards, all we have to do, put our finished side down, and we're going to slide it right into the board we just placed. And this is where a rubber mallet's going to come in handy. We're going to tap it into this board till this groove is tight. I'm now going to use a finish nailer that has 2-inch nails. I'm just going to nail each side with 2 nails to hold it into place. And yes, safety glasses are important to wear here whenever you're using any type of a nailer. So we're going to finish this side with 2 nails as well. Repeat that until we get to the bottom of the bookshelf. Now that the backing's done, we allowed enough time for this to dry. I'm just going to hit this with the palm sander real quick first. Then after hitting with the palm sander, we take the rag that we use for staining and just go right over it real quick. And you can see after that dries all the way, you won't be able to see where we put those screw holes. As you can see, the bookshelf turned out really good so far. I'm going to put a finish on it using polyacrylic polyurethane. This is water-based, so it doesn't have near the fumes as the oil-based polyurethane. And all we have to do with this, stir it up really well and use a 4-inch foam brush. Then we're just going to put a light coat all over this bookshelf, and then we're going to let it dry for at least 2 hours or so. sand it down lightly with 220 sandpaper, then place another coat on it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now to this bookshelf. We have been drying for about 2 or 3 hours. We are totally dry. You can tell when you rub your hand on the board, and the grain has raised a little bit. So after that first coat, we got to use 220 sandpaper and just quickly, lightly hit it. You could also use sandpaper with your hand and hit it and smooth it out too, but I got a palm sander here, so I'm just going to hit it real fast. If you can see how quick you do this here. You can see that quick hit smooth it out really well, and you notice a little white looking dust. That's because the poly is getting sanded really smooth. So I'm going to hit everything with the palm sander before putting on my second coat. Now that the construction of the bookshelf is complete and we have a nice finish on it, I need to talk about how to secure it to the wall. If you don't remember, the top board is actually screwed to the frame of the bookshelf. All we have to do is find our studs wherever we're setting the bookshelf, and then we got to place screws that are long enough to go through the back and into a stud. You cannot have this just freestanding just because it's so top heavy. It could fall over really easy, so definitely secure it to the wall. If you would like to see how I built this mobile workbench that you've been seeing me use in this video, check out this video. It'll help you out.